If you're reasonable, if you're interested in how the world works and what is true altogether, you are open. You're by definition open to further conversation, to more argument, to more evidence. And you're in fact interested to find out if you're mistaken about anything. The only thing that guarantees open-ended collaboration among human beings is a willingness to have our beliefs and behaviors updated and modified by the power of conversation, by the power of argument, by new evidence. Science does this pretty impeccably. Now, not all scientists agree. We don't have this monolithic totalitarian convergence of viewpoints, but the conversation is open, and it is just acknowledged that if an experiment is valid, if it's testing anything about the nature of the universe, really, whether it's run in Baghdad or run in Los Angeles doesn't matter. I believe this is true in spiritual matters and ethical matters as well, and we simply need to extend the same rules of conversation to those domains, and religious dogma is the antithesis of that. It seems to me that the responsibility of science and public intellectuals generally is to be honest. And we don't have to distinguish hard science and soft science here. I mean, the core of science is not mathematical modeling. It is intellectual honesty. It is a willingness to have our certainties about the world constrained by good evidence and good argument. Now, so science might not encompass all intellectual endeavors, as Lawrence pointed out, but intellectual honesty must. But you used this phrase steel manning, which I haven't heard much, but obviously it's the opposite of straw manning someone's argument, and I think it's a crucial feature of what I would generically call intellectual honesty. If you're going to argue against a position, at minimum, you should be able to summarize your opponent's view in a way that he wouldn't find fault with. And better still, if you summarize it in a way that's even better than he or she would come up with on his own, then that is the thing you take down in your argument. That is the way any really civil and productive debate should operate. And what I find most difficult to deal with, our podcast listeners will have heard this 1,000 times, but are the misrepresentations of my positions, wherein the critic isn't even interacting with the view I hold, and I'm getting smeared for this fake view. And I think that's as a general principle of public conversations and just one's interpersonal dealings with people who you don't agree with, steel manning is something we should just have in our heads as something we need to do and expect should be done toward us in these conversations.
So yeah, I think there's certain facts that they're not worth getting. It could be socially harmful to make much of those facts. Mm-hmm. Again, if there's a gene for materialism, is there a gene for Jewish, hoarding, right? Yeah. Like, is that the scientific paper you want to try to write?
Right.
You would have to question the social motives of somebody who would do that. And obviously there's, analogous things you would do in the black community or in any other community.
I'm sympathetic with the feeling that there are certain questions upon which any kind of significant interest suggests that there's something wrong with you. I see these people who seem extremely interested in, say, racial differences in intelligence. They want to study this. They're outraged that it's, a no-go area for science. It's a completely legitimate question to pose biologically, but one wonders, what is the purpose of seeking that information, and what would you do with it if you had it?
I think it would be very easy to stigmatize that research, and there's maybe a reason to avoid it because there's nothing you're going to do with the information that is at all socially positive.
So I saw my friend Douglas Murray on Stefan's podcast, and forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but this is the only thing I've said about Stefan, I think, on my podcast. Many people have been telling me to go on his podcast or have him on mine. I see him talking to my friend Douglas Murray, who is a wonderful person and is much maligned for reasons that are totally unfair. But so he's there talking to Stefan. He clearly doesn't really know who Stefan is, and he's just on yet another popular podcast. And at some point in the conversation, Stefan says something that suggests his rather just suspicious fascination with racial difference.
You can imagine the prurient interest that people would have in that kind of research. It would attract people who were interested in it for the wrong reasons. So every anti-Semite in the world would want to want that to be true.
Because so you have a perfectly congenial conversation with Stefan, and now just one click away, I can find Stefan having a perfectly congenial conversation with Jared Taylor, who I don't know if you know who Taylor is, but Taylor is just a straight-up racist white supremacist, as far as I can tell. He, I don't think, would totally own those terms. He wouldn't apply those terms to himself. But if you see what he says when he's on his home court, actually, no, I'll do him the favor of taking this one note away. Maybe Jared Taylor isn't as straightforward a racist and an anti-Semite as you can find, but you can find him talking to a perfectly straightforward racist and anti-Semite and having a perfectly congenial conversation, finding nothing to disagree with. Right. So
that's interesting.
We're a couple nodes away from the KKK here.
Now, talking about very popular people, Sam Harris also commented on you, and commented, in fact, to one of his guests that he felt uncomfortable even speaking to the guest because by guilt of association, he had concluded that particular guest, who was Douglas Murray, I believe, had talked to Stefan Molyneux on the internet. Stefan Molyneux had made an interview with you. And so Sam Harris concluded that by talking to Douglas Murray, he was 4 or 5 social nodes away from the KKK.
Jesus. Yes, I'm aware of that. This is baffling to me. I think that Sam Harris must know nothing about me other than what the Southern Poverty Law Center says about me. And Sam Harris is a very smart guy. He can use the internet as well as anyone. I don't understand why he doesn't make some small attempt to discover what it is I really think. And if he were to discover what I really think, if he thinks that I'm wrong, presumably he could refute me. But to somehow think that anyone who has spoken to someone who has actually interviewed me is a dangerous and radioactive personality, that just goes to show you the extent to which people are just hypnotized and blinded by this extraordinary tyranny of political correctness that we live under.
And again, to see this phenomenon occur to Sam Harris, who has been making arguments for years. This is an intellectual guy. To some extent, if someone that I don't know at all on Twitter makes an emotional reaction to you or to me, that's somewhat understandable that there are such people in the world. But to hear someone such as Sam Harris, who has been talking about objectivity, who has been talking about factual and reasonable interpretations of the world, is quite scandalous. And it shows that it's not only the extreme left who is currently being I would say, developing a form of ideological tribalism, but even the center of the political spectrum right now is contributing to a form of ideological tribalism and refusal to engage with the other.
If you're reasonable, if you're interested in how the world works and what is true altogether, you are open. You're by definition open to further conversation, to more argument, to more evidence. And you're in fact interested to find out if you're mistaken about anything. If you're mistaken about anything. If you're mistaken about anything. If you're mistaken about anything.